And in other cases, they would take so-called Native Indians and Taino Indians and so-called Mexicans, and they would hang them, right? They would hang them until they were only able to stand on their tippy toes, right on top of hot burning coals that were on fire. So these so-called white people, they showed our nation no mercy. In other cases, the so-called white man, he would cut open the belly of a pregnant so-called Native Indian woman. He would take the baby out and he would stomp it to death. Or he would take the baby and dash it against the stone. Or in other cases, the baby would be dashed against trees or against the ground. So the baby was stomped mercilessly. Okay, they had certain scenarios, right? These so-called white people during the time of slavery, they had certain scenarios where they would take Israelite babies, and when I say Israelite, I'm talking about so-called black, Latino, or Native Indian babies, okay? They would take so-called black babies, and to test their strength, they would rip the baby in half to see how strong they were. Okay? They ripped the baby in half. They would attempt to twist and break his neck and rip his head off, or her head off. You see? You know? What about the transatlantic slave trade? What about the slave trade period, where they would take so-called black, Jamaican, and Haitians, and they would toss them overboard over the ship after putting a cut or a slit in their skin, so that as soon as they landed in the oceans, their blood will flow out. That way, if there were nearby sharks, the sharks would swim in and literally eat that person alive. So that person was eaten alive by sharks. And the reason why the slaves were tossed over the slave ships was to prevent the ship from sinking, because apparently to them there were too many slaves on the slave ship. So to make the ship lighter, they would put a deep cut inside of their slaves and toss them over the boat. And then they would watch the slave get eaten alive by sharks. Okay? You know, and on these slave ships, they did not really, care to give our people proper hygiene, Our people were, peeing and crapping out all on themselves and on other slaves by accident. It smelled horrible down there on them slave ships. It smelled so bad to the point to where now not even the slave masters wanted to go down there to wash the slaves. Okay? Okay? They were stabbing pregnant Israelite women in their stomach with their musket guns. They were shooting down Gad with Gatling guns. They grilled Israelite children alive on metal grills and watched them suffer. Okay? During the time of slavery, they took our children away from us. Our children were sold off to another plantation to be sex slaves. And then when they got old enough, they sent those same so-called black, Latino, or Native Indian slaves out, which they had as sex slaves since they were 4 years old. They would send them right back out. They would send them out into the field to work. And in some cases, they had Israelite children starting at the age of 5 out there in the field working as slaves. Okay. They even had Israelite men who were 50, 60, 70 years old, still out there in the field working all day, every day, no rest. And whenever they gave our people food, they gave us garbage, slop, just like how they used to do in prison, you know. They would feed the slaves bullshit, man. So these devils had no mercy upon our nation. Okay? And if you were a male or a female slave, you know, who refused to have sex with the slave master, you know what the slave master would do? They had a torturous instrument called the pear of anguish, where they would, which it was a tool in the shape of a pear. And what they would do was, if the slave, male or female, would refuse to have sex with the male slave master, they would take that tool and shove it up the rectum of the male or female slave, and then they would twist the knob and stretch out the pear, bringing excruciating pain upon that slave, man. And then they would rip out the tool, ripping out their anus and all kind of other guts and stuff, man. Okay? In some cases, the pear of anguish was shoved into the vagina of the female slaves, okay? Breaking the cartilage and bones inside of their vagina, okay? Sometimes the pear of anguish was shoved into the mouth of the slaves, breaking their jaws. If they were caught lying to the slave master, okay? You know, other heinous acts that was carried out against slaves, namely the so-called Jamaican slaves, was a method called Derby's dose, in which Derby's dose comes from a man named Derby who was working out in the slave field, you know, and you know, this man, he was so hungry, he was starving so bad, to the point to where he ended up picking the sugar canes that he was supposed to be picking for the slave masters. You know, he ended up picking sugar canes and he began eating them. So you know what his punishment was for satisfying his own hunger? The slave masters took him into a wooden cabin. They would they strapped him down to a wooden bed, and then they would have another slave shit in his mouth, and so that he wouldn't spit the shit out of his mouth, they put a cage on his head, some kind of device on his head that would keep his jaw locked in place so he couldn't open his mouth. And there, Derby was left to gag for hours, gagging with all this this human waste in his mouth, man. All this dump in his mouth from another slave. Okay, he would gag from the doo-doo that was in his mouth. He would gag and you know, throw up, but there was nothing he can do to get the waste out of his mouth, because his jaw was locked in place from this cage he had on his head, man. And Derby was not the only one they did this to. They did this to little kids and also to female slaves, man. So Isaiah 47, verse 6, I was wroth with my people, I have polluted mine inheritance and given them into thine hand. Yeah, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai gave us into the hand of our enemies, man, especially the so-called white man. And during the time of slavery, the so-called white man did everything he wanted to us to his heart's desire. And he got away with it, man. Thou didst show them no mercy. Okay, the so-called white man did not show us no mercy during the time of slavery. Upon the ancient hast thou heavily laid thy yoke. So, Salakia brothers, I gotta get ready to clock in at the plantation. You know, I gotta clock in by 4 o'clock. So, Lord's will, I'll continue this lesson on my lunch break and even on my way home, back from work tonight. Shalom.